What civil rights groups call a frightening, humiliating experience recently targeted its 5 millionth New Yorker. Now the NYPD's stop and frisk policy is being put on trial. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. A federal court is hearing the most serious legal challenge yet to the New York Police Department's controversial practice known as stop and frisk. A class action lawsuit argues that the NYPD's use of warrantless stopping and questioning in the city's neighborhoods is an unconstitutional invasion of privacy. The trial will include testimony from a dozen people who say they were targeted because of their race, a contention backed up by civil rights groups who say the policy unfairly targets minorities. The overwhelming majority of the 5 million stopped in the last decade are African American or Latino. In a sign of the atmosphere of mistrust and anger fostered by the policy, tensions boiled over earlier this month when police shot dead teenager Kimani Gray on March the 8th during a stop and frisk in Brooklyn. Days of protests followed. Despite complaints, New York's Mayor Michael Bloomberg and the NYPD say the policy is working and point to lower crime figures in New York. But with crime also reduced in other cities that have not implemented stop and frisk, is the practice really necessary? From New York, Kristen Salumi reports.
In this East New York City neighborhood, crime and poverty are rampant, but many young men say it's the New York Police Department that they fear the most.
How you doing? All right.
In fact, some were afraid to give their last names when describing their dealings with police.
What's going on, y'all?
All right, how's that?
All right, good, man. How y'all doing?
I've done had guns pointed out on me just based off the fact of my appearance. You know, stopped and frisked, as I said, numerous times in one day, never find anything. It's just ongoing harassment, it seems.
David Orlicht has also been stopped and searched or frisked in his neighborhood of Manhattan.
It's scary. You know, when it's happening, it's embarrassing. The fear is always there.
It's an issue that I've been dealing with since I was 15, and it hurts.
Orlicht is one of the people now suing the police over their stop and search tactics, which have been well documented by neighborhood groups. The lawsuit accuses police of violating a part of the U.S. Constitution that prohibits unreasonable searches.
The officer has to have what's called reasonable articulable suspicion of criminal activity. And it's our firm belief, and we think the evidence will show this, that in hundreds of thousands of cases each year, the police department and the officers do not have reasonable articulable suspicion when they stop New Yorkers on the street.
The lawsuit also argues that police are illegally targeting minorities.
Police data shows that 87% of those stopped and frisked are either black or Hispanic, while those groups make up just 53% of the city's population. Only 6% of those stopped are arrested, while less than 2% are found to have a gun or other contraband.
Still, city officials say the searches are a regular part of police work and credit the policy with helping to bring down crime.
Stops take hundreds of guns off the street each year. The possibility of a stop is what scares the would-be bad guys into not carrying guns.
That argument could be central in this case, but previous courts have ruled that crime prevention is not a legitimate reason to violate basic rights. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, New York.
And joining me to discuss the NYPD's stop and frisk policy and the latest challenge against it are Heather McDonald, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute in New York. Also from New York, Carl Dix, writer and longtime activist against police brutality. And here in the studio, Vincent Warren, the executive director at the Center for Constitutional Rights, the organization leading the case against the NYPD. Let's nail down this lawsuit first of all, Vincent. What exactly is the basis of the lawsuit? What are you arguing in court at the moment?
Well, this lawsuit is to end discriminatory policing in New York City. We have a policy called stop and frisk. The stop and frisk policy, as we showed in the opening, has a devastating effect on communities, and it unfairly targets African American and Latino folks. What we're not trying to do is to end stop and frisk as a crime-fighting tool, but what we are trying to do is to stop the unconstitutional stop and frisks that are happening in the city. And what that means is that the police have only the ability to stop people based on reasonable and articulable suspicion. When they stop entire communities or people because they're black or brown, that does not pass constitutional muster. And we're trying to get the police department to stop using race as a proxy for criminal activity.
So this is what, the Fourth Amendment, the 14th Amendment?
Yes, there are two bases under the Constitution. The Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. So when the police department stop now 500,000 people a year based upon no suspicion whatsoever, that violates the Fourth Amendment. When the police department stops 87% of those folks are African American and Latino based on race, that violates the 14th Amendment of equal protection.
How do you prove there's no reasonable suspicion in these stops?
Well, because we know that for the 500,000 stops that they do every year, in terms of guns, for example, they only recover, the police department recovers less than 1% of their stops are recovering guns. And that we know that if they did a random checkpoint, if they just set up checkpoints around New York City and just randomly stopped New Yorkers at the checkpoint, they would statistically recover more guns than they do in their policy of stopping 500,000 people in New York City.
But you'll be aware of the argument that this isn't a matter of racial profiling, it's that these are the areas where crime is most prevalent, and in fact that African American and Latino males are disproportionately affected by gun crime.
Well, that's certainly been the argument for a very long period of time, but here's why it's not true. In the context of this litigation that the Center for Constitutional Rights is doing, we got all of the data for stops that the police department made, their own data. And we looked at those stops, and we found that the police department stops African Americans at a high rate, whether it's a low crime area, a high crime area, or a medium crime area, so that they're stopping black and Latino folks regardless of what the crime in the community is. Also, we know that in each one of those areas, that they're saying that the reason why they stopped people were things like furtive movements. More than half of the stops are based upon things called furtive movements, which nobody can really define. It's basically what the officer makes up. So we also know that it's not based on any suspicion in low crime areas, high crime areas, or medium crime areas. This is just a blanket policy that is really pushed by a quota system to get as many stops as you can.
And in fact, actually, when in the rare instances where guns are recovered, it tends to be amongst white people who are stopped.
Well, that's what's so interesting about this, is that what most people think is that the problem of crime is a black problem, and that simply isn't true. Crime doesn't know any color, and when you actually look at the statistics as to who's more likely to have contraband or to have guns or weapons on them, actually white people are found at 3%, and they're much higher than African American folks with guns, which is at 1%.
And contraband also means drugs, presumably. I mean, this is technically about guns, but this is clearly drugs have a part to play in all this as well.
Well, that's true. Here's what it's really about. The New York City Police Department should be stopping crime, and whether that crime are drugs or whether they're guns or whether they're something else, that's what we want them to do.
Right.
The policy of targeting race and targeting entire communities does not do that. It is also unconstitutional, and that's why we filed the lawsuit.
I mean, and there's a sidebar that actually statistically, again, white people are the same or more likely to be dealing in drugs or using drugs than black and Latino?
Well, that's certainly what the national data says,
right.
And that's also what the police department's data says as well.
All right, Heather McDonald, what do you make of all those arguments? And I know that you're a proponent of stop and frisk. Does that convince you, then?
Well, first of all, Shihab, may I add a fact to your introduction that was, I think, crucial. You talked about the police shooting in East Flatbush last week. You left out the fact that, according to the police and several witnesses, the victim had pointed a gun at the cops, which is why that they shot him back. So that wasn't just a random
but
shooting.
Other witnesses say
I
that
agree
was not
with
the
Vince
case.
that, excuse me, okay, but they have, that's nevertheless out there. That is a claim.
Just a moment, Carl. We'll get to you in a moment.
Is rather incomplete. I agree with Vince that this has to be done constitutionally. The issue is, do they have evidence that there are massive numbers of unconstitutional stops? Vince is wrong that there is not racially disparate crime. Blacks and Hispanics, according to the victims and witnesses of violent crime, commit 98% of all shootings in New York City. This, again, is according to victims and witnesses to those shootings. whites commit a little over 1%, even though they're 35% of the city's population. It is crime disparities like that that is putting police officers at higher numbers in minority neighborhoods. I agree with Vince, and I agree with the plaintiffs, that being stopped when you're totally innocent of any crime is infuriating, humiliating, and I understand that people are saying, I'm fed up with this. Nevertheless, the alternative, I think, is worse, which is the types of crime catastrophes that we had at the early part of the 1990s, when you had children sleeping in bathtubs to avoid stray bullets, senior citizens terrified to go out to go shopping or pick up their Social Security check. This is the lesser of two evils. And the fact is that no other city has brought crime down to the extent that New York has. Yes, other cities have had crime drops, no question. There's been a national crime drop. The difference is that New York's crime drop has been twice as deep and has lasted twice as long as any other place in the country, to the point now where we resemble a suburb in our crime rate. Chicago is often held out by advocates as an example of a place that doesn't do proactive policing. They had over 500 murders last year. With 1/3 the population of New York, we had 414. So New York, again, is off the maps, and the primary beneficiaries of this crime drop have been minority males, who've made up 79% of the people who haven't been killed. If there was an alternative to stop and frisks, we should do it. I agree, but at this point, we don't have an alternative.
There's so much to chew on there, the McDonald's. So let's run through some of those points. Actually, first of all, because this issue of Kimani Gray and our description of it came into your statement there, we were going to deal with that later on in the program, but let me give the differing accounts of that incident, and then perhaps we can move on from that. The NYPD said that when the officers approached Kimani Gray, the 16-year-old turned around, pointed a revolver at them. That's when the police fired 11 rounds at Gray, hitting him several times. But an eyewitness to the incident says that Gray was unarmed when police shot him. The woman who lived in an apartment right above where the incident happened says an officer stood right over Gray, continuing to shoot him while he was on the ground. The incident resulted in 3 days of community protests against the NYPD's tactics. It has since emerged that the two police officers involved in the shooting have been accused of civil rights violations before. They were sued for illegal searches and false arrests, and the city settled the cases out of court and paid out $215,000 in total. We're just dealing that in passing because it was mentioned, but Carl Dix, your thoughts?
Well, first off, let's add that 3 of the shots that hit Kimani Gray were in his back. We should add that, but we should also look at this as a stop and frisk that was lethal, just like the killing of Ramarley Graham by police in the Bronx. And let's just step back and look at this. What stop and frisk is, it is part of treating blacks and Latinos, especially young blacks and Latinos, like criminals, guilty until proven innocent if they can survive to prove their innocence. This is what it comes down to. I launched a campaign of nonviolent civil disobedience along with Cornel West to stop and frisk. As part of that campaign, I got arrested, put in overnight booking in Queens, and I was there with several dozen people, most of whom were there for stop and frisk. Some of these people were in jail because they didn't have an ID on them, and they were held until they could get someone to bring an ID down. Now, past laws used to be in effect in South Africa under apartheid, but that is actually a routine thing that the NYPD does.
Let me pick up on the points that we have here, and I have a couple. We need to get to the question of African-American crime rates. I know that Heather McDonald says that African-Americans commit massive amounts of crimes, and that's why the police do what they do. But it's wrong. And it's wrong because there's no way that Heather McDonald would know that. Because when you look at the police statistics that we have in our litigation, only 40% of the crimes actually list the race of the person who committed them. It's unknown in 60% of the
Heather
cases.
McDonald, what were you basing that statement on?
What am I basing that statement on?
Yeah.
That is what's reported crime. That is what is reported to the police, is that blacks commit 66% of all violent crime in New York City, even though they're 23% of the population. I would also like to say that, if we're to the point now where we think that every time an officer says there's a gun, he's lying or he's planted the gun. At some point, that becomes a situation that's just untenable.
But can you understand why there's a lack of trust, though, given
evidence that the officers here had planted the gun?
Right.
The fact that they had complaints raised against them may simply mean that they were active cops, because that happens a lot by people who are arrested. Maybe those complaints were perfectly valid. I don't know what they were.
Right.
I don't think they were resolved against the police officers. But I went to East Flatbush, and yes, you can find people there who are angry. You can also find a lot of people who say, young black males who say, I've never been stopped because I'm a good boy. I don't hang out on the corners at night. There's many different voices out there. There's a lot of people.
The stop and frisk policy, it's argued, has made it very difficult to find out what is the truth.
It is. And I want the drug dealers off the corner.
Much more difficult to find out what the truth is. And in fact, the question is really not assuming that the police are lying. But the real question is, based on what we know and what we've seen, why should we automatically assume that they're telling the truth?
Heather McDonald, there's this other point, though, that where you talk about the amazing drop. The drop, just a moment, Carl, just because we need to get this in because we're running out of time already. This amazing drop in crime using stop and frisk and other technological advances. But there was a report, and a lot of that's based on the work of Franklin Zimmering. But that appears to have been debunked by a report that came out just last month. I mean, the conventional wisdom is from 1994 to 2001, under the Giuliani administration, thousands more police officers were hired. The NYPD ramped up stop and frisk procedures, began to focus on fighting crime by putting more police in statistically high crime areas. But this new study published last month by Professor David Greenberg at New York University found that violent and property crimes were dropping just as fast in the 5 years before Giuliani took office and these policies came into effect. He did not find a link between more police officers on the street and the drop in violent crime. And another study that looked specifically at the police's stop and frisk policies found that it had little impact on catching criminals. According to that, between 2003 and 2010, when stop and frisk really ramped up, the police made an arrest in only 6% of stops. And ultimately, Greenberg's conclusion was the exact causes of violent crime and what caused them to plummet remains a mystery. And as you say yourself, look, I mean, if there's an alternative, we should use it. But that suggests you do have misgivings about stop and frisk. The point is we can't make conclusive connections to stop and frisk and the drop in violent crime that we saw in New York because violent crime was dropping in New York before stop and frisk.
Greenberg's study is very complicated. The regression analysis is sophisticated. I think there's many ways of critiquing how he's chosen his temporal variables and his spatial ones. There's a consensus among criminologists that hotspot policing is extremely effective. And what officers do in hotspots is look around for criminal behavior and try and make proactive questions. Not all stops result in frisks. Sometimes it's just going up to somebody and asking a question. Right. I think that's what communities want. They want people to be out there on the street. The claim that stop and frisk are somehow this lethal weapon just doesn't stand up to the facts. Last year there were 9 people shot by the police. Practically all of them were armed and dangerous.
Right, but we're also talking about constitutional rights.
The cops are not the threat in these neighborhoods. We still have over 400 murders. That's what the problem is. Last summer there was a 4-year-old boy shot on a basketball court in the Bronx. That's not happening in Battery Park City, the south side of Manhattan. If it were, cops would be in those neighborhoods. We should also be hearing, I think, at the Floyd trial, we've heard very heartrending stories from people who've been stopped. And again, my heart goes out to them if you're innocent. But we should also be hearing heartrending stories of people who were killed by illegal guns and other weapons on the street, and what that felt like to the family members.
Carl Dix.
Okay, look, there is already an untenable situation out there because people who are acting in East Flatbush, some of them are citing the killing by police of Chantel Davis because they thought she had stolen a car. They're citing the police running over Tamar Robinson because they thought he was stealing bricks. There is a situation that people are angry about, and they are right to be angry. There is a criminalization of the youth. It's not particular to New York and stop and frisk, but it is concentrated in New York and stop and frisk. And it represents a continuation of the oppression of black people that's been a part of this country and this system from the very beginning. Because if we take the lens back, The deindustrialization of the urban areas feeds into the question of crime in Black and Latino areas. The wrecking of the educational system. None of this is stuff that the youth or their parents did. This is something that the capitalist system and its very operation did. And that's part of what we have to get at to deal with these problems.
Clearly we have to join the dots with the rest of the criminal justice system and the racial disparity, and that we have done programs on that before, which I would recommend our audience to watch. But there are a number of other issues there, Vincent. For example, where the homicide rate didn't go down in New York, stop and frisks had increased. I mean, the statistical correlation isn't terribly clear. And then there's this other issue of quotas, which are technically illegal, but the Nation magazine has just come up with an investigation. One of the allegations, which should be heard during the trial, I believe, that the NYPD and the NYPD unions have agreed on quotas for stopping and frisking and arrests.
It becomes you're just stopping people who you know aren't doing anything, and then you're frisking them, you know, pretty much turns you upside down and violates your rights.
People who might commit the crime, I'm forced to write them. Sometimes I don't know if they committed it or not. There might be a beer right next to them. Don't know if it's theirs. But I'm under these time constraints. I'm running out of time, and I gotta make the quota. And if I don't, I get retaliated against.
You could do amazing work for years. In those 1 or 2 months when you bring in low activity, you're the worst cop ever in the police department. And they'll come after you. That's the way the police department is.
The way I think about it is, say a fireman is told by his supervisor, we need you to put out 15 fires this month. And if you don't put out 15 fires, you're gonna get penalized. So if he doesn't find 15 fires to put out, is that his fault? It's not, but the fireman might even go out there and start setting fires, causing fires, you know?
So Vincent Warren, there we have then, first of all, we have the rather uncertain at best statistical correlation between stop and frisk and some of these tactics and a decline in crime and violent crime and homicide in particular. But then you also have this quota system, though, which presumably should have alarm bells ringing, I suppose.
No, it definitely should. And we know that the national crime rate has been dropping since 1994, 1995. That is an objective fact.
Well, in New York since 1988.
1988. Yeah. And that we also know that every police commissioner worth his or her salt is going to take credit for the drop in crime, whether or not the policies that they're employing are contributing to that at all. For my money, when I bring umbrellas outside, it usually doesn't rain. That doesn't mean that I get to take credit for the sunshine. And that's what the police departments are doing. So we know that there's no correlation between stop and frisk and the reduction of crime. And we also know that there is no credible study out there that shows a relationship between the stop and frisk practice and the reduction of crime. And that leads us then to the quota system. How are these policies being driven? And you heard from the officers, and there will be testimony played at our stop and frisk trial in federal court around these officers talking about how they are being pushed to get the numbers, to make the arrests, to make the collars, to make the stops. They get credit for the number of stops that they make. And as we're hearing here, it has no correlation to the constitutional piece, which is there any reason whatsoever to make these stops?
Heather McDonald, I'll give you the last word. 30 seconds there. That's all we have, I'm afraid.
Well, some of these officers have disciplinary histories, so if we're going to talk about disciplinary histories, these are productivity goals. We don't want officers sitting in their cars eating donuts and drinking coffee, and they're very low productivity goals. To have officers say, look, we expect you to bring safety to this community because people in minority communities have the same right to live free from fear of criminals as those in wealthy white neighborhoods. And that's what this is about, is trying to bring justice and freedom from fear to all people. And there's been no government program as effective in bringing economic activity to inner city neighborhoods as New York policing, because it has brought crime down, and that brought about a renaissance of New York.
The problem is not lazy cops. The problem is unconstitutional policing. Unconstitutional policing in this city, in New York City, means that the vast majority of people that the police stop and question are innocent, have done nothing. That is the problem. And the reason why we have a constitution that prohibits that is not to tie the hands of the police, it's to protect the people that are innocent. And that's exactly the people that we're trying to represent.
Vincent Warren, you got the last word then. Carl Dix, thank you very much. Heather McDonald, thank you. Vincent Warren, thank you. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.